What makes a film historically accurate? Does it truly need to be faithful to the history to successfully capture the essence of that time period in question? Now, this is actually a question I've asked myself a lot recently, having rewatched one of my favorite miniseries of all time, The Blue and the Gray. Much lesser known than North and South, The Blue and the Gray premiered on TV in 1982 and is a three-part miniseries depicting the years between 1859 and 1865. It follows the story of a single family and how it is torn apart, then destroyed by the Civil War's utter brutality. But is it successful at depicting the American Civil War? I want to say right up front that I think it doesn't just successfully capture the war and its horrors, but it also does so better visually than most media both before and after it. Now keep in mind, and I'll certainly say this in this video later, this is a made-for-TV miniseries, so there are tropes within it that are certainly common of its time. But I'm happy to say that it's nowhere near of a soap opera like North and South, focusing instead on the war itself, and understanding that the war is actually dramatic enough without the need for constant steamy romances. Instead, the romances we do get within The Blue and the Gray are much more subdued, and I'd argue more nuanced and believable, as they are never truly overshadowed by the epic scale of the Civil War itself. Nor does The Blue and the Gray glorify the war or emphasize the bravery of those fighting in it, like we'd see in films such as Gettysburg, which, in full disclaimer, is still one of my favorite films of all time. There is a place, and I will argue this tooth and claw, I think there is a place for films like this, and for me, Gettysburg succeeded in droves for what it was absolutely trying to do. For The Blue and the Gray, there is no glory. There is no grand, sweeping epicness of men marching into battle. Instead, it portrays the war for what it actually was, a dark tragedy, which literally tore families apart, then destroyed them. Like all wars, the glory is more of a fantasy, not the reality. Thus, The Blue and the Gray fits more in line with something like All Quiet on the Western Front than a film like Gone with the Wind, North and South, or even Gettysburg. What shines about The Blue and the Gray is its ability to not sugarcoat the brutality within the Civil War itself. Sure, it's toned down, in the sense that, it's a 1980s television miniseries, but not in the sense that it shies away from the suffering of those involved. And it doesn't overly favor one side over the other. This series isn't Southern propaganda, like we'd see in Gods and Generals, and other Civil War flicks made both before and after. It damns the South, actually, for the institution of slavery, and does not shy away from said issues. That being said, it also showcases people from the South who aren't just racist jerks. Paul Geiser's brother Matt certainly is not a villain. In many ways, neither is his sister. These are people who have witnessed the horrors of war. Paul's sister loses her husband, her house, her income, and nearly starves to death during the Battle of Vicksburg. Matt loses a portion of his leg after being shot. Literally, a part of him was taken away from him because of the war. Now, that all being said, not all the Northerners are also depicted as saints. There is a specific scene that comes to mind where Paul stops a few Union soldiers from raping a black woman. That's one that comes to mind. Or the Union cavalrymen breaking into the Geiser residence with the purpose of burning the house to the ground. This stuff happened. There's documented proof that this stuff is what happened. It was this ugly, ugly shade of gray on several areas. Now, while these characters aren't real, after all, this is historical fiction, there are plenty of records showcasing that these events did happen, and happened relatively frequently throughout the war, particularly in the later half of the war, second half of 1863 through 1865. Now, all of this goes back to the question that I asked at the beginning of this video. Does a film need to 100% stick to history to be considered a good representation of the subject in question? And my answer is no. It absolutely does not. The Blue and the Gray has loads of historical inaccuracies, particularly within the battle sequences themselves. The uniforms are a bit wrong in places, and we see some trapdoor Springfields here and there, and their artillery are quite clearly replicas in some parts, but the Blue and the Gray has a lot of that within it that you gotta kind of get past if you're a history buff. But what makes me say this series is one of the best portrayals of the American Civil War is the tragedy of the whole piece itself. It permeates the series from literally beginning to end, utilizing the setting to tell an epic story of a family being torn to pieces. Rarely has a Civil War series or film captured such a notion on such a personal level. The filmmakers and crew understood just what made the American Civil War so tragic, and why it resonates to this day in our subconscious. It was literally brother against brother, families utterly torn apart, then eviscerated as the war continued and grew exponentially more brutal. By focusing on one family, we see the rifts form. At first it's political, then it's personal, and then finally blown over into all-out war. It's the national story, told on a personal and relatable scale. It's hard to relate to the overall political conditions within the United States when looking at it from afar. Bring it in close, make it personal. How does it shape the everyday person, or in this case, a farm family in Virginia? What made the South so different than the North? Well, we could go on for hours and explain the agricultural and industrial emphasis on how the North was industrial, the South was more agricultural, and how that is a vastly oversimplification of that. That's not what we want to talk about within this video. Instead, the Blue and the Gray showcases the differences between the North and South by focusing it down to one family. The other side of the Geyser family, the Hales, they are newspaper owners. They are also depicted as being intellectual. They're more middle class than you would see within the Geyser family itself over in Virginia. The Hale boys are actually going to school. They're learning to be intellectuals, industrialists, engineers. While the Geysers are far more focused on maintaining their farm and the status quo. And that status quo blows up in their face, almost literally, when a former slave is hanged on their property. This brilliantly showcases the rug being ripped out from under Southern society and showing the ugly underbelly of its entire organization. It brilliantly dismantles, with just a few words, the myth of Southern hospitality and the Southern gentleman. It helps remind us why the Civil War needed to be fought. Slavery needed to end. And the Blue and the Gray does not shy away from it. And it does such in a way that's not overbearing, but goddamn quite realistic. Throughout the series, slavery is not mentioned too much on the surface, but it's constantly seen within the background. Look at the Vicksburg scenes, which are some of my favorite parts of the series. There's one case where we see a white family, and they're being fed, but the slaves are not. It's shown that inequality, not spoken. And the show is smart enough to let us connect the dots for ourselves. Let's highlight another reason why the Blue and the Gray becomes a great representation of the Civil War. Rarely have I seen disease tackled within the media portraying the war itself. After all, this is how the first Hale sibling dies. It's of dysentery, not from wounds on the battlefield. In fact, him being in the army itself is something people rarely tackle within the histories, and did in fact happen within northern states quite frequently. People were so taken by the idea of a quick and easy victory and the glory over the South, young men were just itching to join up in the first year. It's not like vetting back in the 1860s is even a quarter of what it is now. The series even goes as far as showing the boy ripping off a piece of paper, writing down 18 on it, then sticking it inside of his shoe. That was actually a common practice for people who are underaged, trying to sneak into the army and get away with it. They would write it down on a piece of paper, stick it in a shoe to remind themselves that they needed to be 18, despite the fact that they weren't. They were lying. Now, how about them bushwhackers, or the guerrilla wars going on within the border states? Now, it's too bad this series didn't showcase Kentucky in any way. That would have been really interesting, but I applaud it for showing the disconnect in places like Maryland. And it isn't like other movies depicting this period, focusing on, recruit finders in the South or escaped slave finders and slave hunters and stuff like that. No, these are people who are just discontent with federal rule, doing what they can to disrupt Union supply chains and communications in any way, shape, and form that they possibly can. Speaking of which, how many movies or TV shows do you know actually portray the Peninsula Campaign, or Vicksburg, or even Battle of the Wilderness? This show runs the gambit of what kind of warfare we saw within the Civil War. It covers the more traditional battles like we'd see at Bull Run, then transfers over to siege and trench warfare with Vicksburg, then to the utter ugliness that was the wilderness combat within 1864. Now, once again, and I said I would bring this up later, keep in mind that this is an 80s television miniseries. I am shocked it got away with some of what it did, but it never really gets overly gory or blatantly cruel like we'd see in something like, I don't know, the movie Cold Mountain, for example. But this show no less depicts the utter horrors of the American Civil War in a way that hits you more on a personal level than a visceral one. My favorite example of this is the slow change of Paul Geyser from a naive idealist to a more grounded, realistic young man. I like the detail that as the war goes on, his portraits become less focused on capturing the moment in reality to more of an idea. This is embodied within 2 scenes where his friends flip through his notebook. On both occasions, we see the devastation of war and its effects it has on the human body. All this cumulates with a metaphorical picture of the devil slaying soldiers with a saber. In fact, one of Paul's friends even says,
"The matter, friend, is that you've seen one too many men die."
Does that not describe most of the soldiers witnessing the carnage around them? The show brings up a good point of something that is all too often overlooked, not just in the 1860s, but right through World War I, and that's PTSD, the horrific after effects the American Civil War took upon those who fought it. There was over 30,000 amputations performed throughout the war, and one of our main characters loses an arm to help drive this notion forward. But you see these young men, particularly with John Geyser and a few of the Hale brothers, shift from these clean-shaven young men eager for a fight to hardened, world-weary, and sometimes lost souls. Rarely has the idea of PTSD been addressed in Civil War fiction, and while I wish the show played with this a little bit more, I'm glad it was at least addressed. If anyone wants a really good book talking about this very subject, I highly recommend Michael C.C. Adams' Living Hell, The Dark Side of the Civil War. While I disagree with a lot of his conclusions, it's a wonderful book for sourcing a lot of primary documents like letters and journals. It paints a truly hellish war, and one I think needs to be portrayed more in literature and fiction depicting the American Civil War. And I give the Blue and the Gray massive props for trying, given the limitations of the day, to portray the Civil War for what it was, and not what just popular memory likes to think the Civil War was about. Now, if you're looking for a sweeping epic with thousands of extras, you're not gonna get this. This isn't War and Peace of the American Civil War. It isn't anything like that. For example, let's look at the first Battle of Bull Run for a moment, and compare it to its most immediate counterpart, North and South. There's no question that North and South is a larger series. Their battles have thousands of extras shooting at each other to help showcase the scale many of these battles took on. But the Blue and the Gray just doesn't have such a luxury. It is clear their budget was far more limited, and thus the filmmakers did the next best thing that they could. This is actually directed by Andrew V. McLaglen, who is best known for his westerns, particularly those with John Wayne. But if you look at his filmography, you can see a competent man who is good at structuring action sequences, or in the very least guiding his second and third unit directors into capturing the action needed. Look at the Wild Geese and the Devil's Brigade, for example. Or hell, let's look at one of my personal favorite Civil War movies of all time, Shenandoah, starring James Stewart. All these movies do an excellent job at making the fighting really up close and personal. The Blue and the Gray is no different. It focuses on all these raw recruits and their panic coming face to face with the enemy. It focuses on the terror of them running away after Jackson's countercharge. To better emphasize what I mean, let's look at the Battle of the Wilderness. Now, how accurate is the battle itself within the series? Not really. It's not really accurate at all. I can't say that it is. Yet I will call it a good visual representation of the battle itself. There's no telling where the enemy is. It's hard to figure out through the smoke, who is friend or foe. And the Blue and the Gray only follows a single unit into the woods. And that's it. No grand battle, but a brief and personal one where, inadvertently, the Hales and the Geyser families meet. They just don't know it. Makes you really wonder how many families in the real Civil War had this happen, where they were literally shooting at each other, and they just didn't know it. But that is all questionable. Everything that I just said there, that is all questionable. And I understand other historians being like, what the fuck, that was terrible. What the Blue and the Gray nails on the head was the forest fires that started because of the fighting. It's how our main protagonist loses his brother, after all. He is wounded, you know. Mark Geiser is wounded and left against a tree, only for the fires to slowly get closer and closer, and suddenly he's burned to death. That scream that we hear during all that, it's truly gut-wrenching, and it's handled extremely well, and the filmmakers understood just what made that battle so terrible in the first place. After all, the real Battle of the Wilderness was so horrific, not just in the fighting, but also in its aftermath. During the battle, it was so confused that people couldn't tell if they were friend or foe. There was a lot of friendly fire. General Longstreet was horribly wounded by his own men. Ironically, this is around the same area where Stonewall Jackson was wounded by friendly fire. But it's after the battle where I think the real horror begins. Because after the battle, there are countless diary entries and testimonies from soldiers recalling the screaming and the moans of agony of those trapped in the woods, being burned to death because no one could or would go out there to help them. The sheer brutality was so fierce at the Battle of Wilderness, it's even said that General Grant broke down and cried. Now let that sink in. And while I wish the Blue and the Gray got to truly portray the Battle of the Wilderness on the scale such as, the first Battle of Bull Run within the same series, I'm no less impressed at their portrayal of the confusion and the aftermath of the battle, where I think most movies and shows, made around this same time period probably would have just glanced over it. I really love this miniseries. I was tickled by it when I rewatched it again, because I haven't seen it in a few years. I believe it is currently up on YouTube for free, and the version that is up on YouTube is the correct version to watch. There are two cuts. There is the original TV miniseries, and then there is a recut. And the recut is about 100 minutes shorter. It is a terrible hack job of the original series. Watch the original cut. I really do recommend it. I don't think you'll be disappointed. Just remember that this is an 80s television miniseries, so keep that in mind while you're watching it. All that being said, thank you so much for watching. More history videos and historical fiction videos will be coming out soon. And in the end, this is Adam Noyce of AN Productions saying, sayonara.